The dust of redemption gulch, Nevada, tasted of grit and failed promises, a flavor Arthur Kent knew well. It coated his tongue and settled in the lines around his eyes as he rode his black mare down the town's main thoroughfare in the oppressive heat of an 1878 summer. He had $2,000 in his saddlebags, earned with a steady hand and a cold eye, and a plan to buy a piece of land so far from towns like this that he might forget the man he'd been. His horse, Bess, shifted uneasily beneath him, her ears twitching at the tinny racket from a saloon and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Arthur's gaze swept the clapboard storefronts, the land office, the assayer, the general mercantile. It was a place built on speculation, raw and hungry. Then he saw her. She was standing near the water trough, a small figure lost in the chaotic shuffle of freight wagons and prospectors. She was Chinese, dressed in a tattered, beige prairie dress that hung on her thin frame, a garment clearly not her own. But it was her feet that held his attention. They were bare, stained with the filth of the street, the soles likely raw. She moved with a dazed, aimless drift, her eyes wide and unseeing, as if she were a ghost who hadn't yet realized she was dead. The townsfolk gave her a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of contempt and curiosity. A woman like that, alone and unescorted, was a problem. An abandoned piece of property. A flicker of something, not pity, but a disquieting sense of familiarity, pricked at the back of Arthur's mind. He dismissed it. He'd seen 1,000 desperate faces in a dozen desolate towns. This one was no different. His business was at the land office, not with the town's cast-offs. He swung down from his horse, the leather of his gun belt creaking in protest. He tied Bess to the hitching post, giving her a reassuring pat on the neck. His focus was on the future, a quiet plot of earth where the only thing he'd have to fight was drought and his own memories. But as he stepped onto the boardwalk, a group of hard-faced men spilled out of the saloon, their laughter loud and coarse. They saw her, and their amusement curdled into something uglier. "Well, look what the cat drug in," one of them sneered, a big man with a sweat-stained hat. "Looks like Sterling's mail-order doll got loose." Another man laughed. "Heard he sent her packing. Said she wasn't worth the shipping fee." They started to circle her, their movement slow and predatory. The woman flinched, pulling her arms around herself, but she did not cry out. She simply stood her ground, her small chin lifted, a silent, defiant island in a sea of hostility. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not his fight. Getting involved was the last thing a man like him, a man trying to become invisible, should do. He could turn his back, walk into the land office, and leave her to her fate. It was the smart thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Therefore, he found his feet moving, not toward the office, but toward the trough. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed himself between the men and the woman, his presence a quiet but absolute barrier. He was not a large man, but he stood with a stillness that promised terrible speed. "She's bothering no one," Arthur said, his voice low and even. The big man bristled, his hand inching toward the pistol on his hip. "This ain't your concern, stranger. This is town business." "I'm making it my concern," Arthur replied. The air grew thick and heavy. The sounds of the street seemed to fade, leaving only the tense silence between the men. The sun beat down, merciless. Arthur didn't blink. He just watched the man's hand, his own resting loosely near his Colt. He knew this dance. He was tired of it, but his body remembered the steps. A long moment passed. The man weighed the odds, his eyes darting from Arthur's calm face to the worn grip of his pistol. He saw not a farmer or a prospector, but something else entirely. Something he wanted no part of. With a muttered curse, he spat on the ground and backed away, gesturing for his friends to follow. "She ain't worth dying for," he grumbled, and they retreated into the saloon. The street slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Arthur didn't watch them go. He turned to the woman. Her eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on his face. The dazed look was gone, replaced by a sharp, unnerving intelligence. "Thank you," she said. Her English was perfect, carrying only the faintest trace of an accent. "They'll be back," he said, his tone clipped. "You need to get off the street." "I have nowhere to go." It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without a hint of self-pity. He sighed, the sound of a man surrendering to a battle he hadn't wanted. "There's a boarding house at the end of the street. Run by a woman named Mrs. Gable. She's fair." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few silver coins. "This will get you a room for a few nights. And some food." He held the money out to her. She looked at the coins, then back at his face. She did not take them. "I cannot pay you back. It's not a loan." He pressed the coins into her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the blistering heat. For a moment, their hands touched, and that strange flicker of recognition returned, stronger this time, like a half-remembered song. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He was a man who had trained himself to feel nothing, yet this stranger was stirring something deep within him. He did not yet know that the woman standing before him held the key to a past he thought was locked away forever. He made sure she was settled in a room at the boarding house, paying Mrs. Gable for a full week in advance. The landlady, a stern but decent woman, looked from Arthur to the Chinese woman with shrewd eyes but asked no questions beyond what was necessary. Once the door to her room was closed, Arthur felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by a surge of irritation at himself. He had come to Redemption Gulch to sever ties, not forge new ones. He had spent his savings, marked himself in the eyes of the town, and entangled himself in a stranger's troubles, all because of an impulse he couldn't explain. He spent the afternoon at the land office, looking over maps of available homestead claims. The clerk was a weaselly man who eyed him with suspicion, no doubt having heard about the incident in the street. Arthur's questions about a particular quarter section of land up in the high meadow were met with evasive answers. The best parcels, it seemed, were already spoken for by a Mr. Sterling. The name landed like a stone in Arthur's gut. Later that evening, he found himself standing outside the boarding house again. He told himself he was just checking to make sure the woman was safe, that the men from the saloon hadn't come back. He bought a tray of food from the hotel restaurant, stew, bread, a piece of apple pie, and carried it up the stairs. He knocked softly on her door. "It's Arthur Kent," he said. "I brought you something to eat." She opened the door. She had washed her face and hands, and her black hair was combed neatly, though still damp. The tattered dress seemed even more out of place in the clean, sparse room. He stepped inside, placing the tray on a small table by the window. The room was stuffy, the air thick with the day's accumulated heat. "You should not have," she said, but her eyes were fixed on the food with a hunger she couldn't hide. "A person's got to eat," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He turned to leave. "Wait." Her voice was soft, but it stopped him cold. He turned back. She was standing by the table, her hands clasped before her. The fading light from the window illuminated the fine lines of her face, a face that was becoming more familiar with every passing second. "You do not know who I am, do you?" she asked. He frowned. "Should I?" She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. She searched his face, looking for something he couldn't guess. "We grew up together. In California. Near the Sacramento River." Arthur's mind went blank. California was another lifetime, a place he had surgically removed from his memory. He remembered a boy with dirt-caked knees and a head full of foolish dreams. He remembered a creek and the sound of his father's laughter. He remembered the fire that took it all away, leaving him with nothing but ash and a burning rage that had shaped the next 15 years of his life. "My father ran the laundry," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "You used to bring him your family's linens. You would wait for me by the creek behind our building." The image hit him then, so sharp and clear it stole his breath. A little girl with 2 long, black braids and eyes that crinkled when she smiled. A girl who wasn't afraid of snakes or frogs, who could skip a stone across the water better than he could. A girl named Mylene, he breathed. The name felt foreign on his tongue. She smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. You called me my. She reached into a small cloth pouch she wore around her neck and pulled something out. She opened her palm. Lying there was a small, perfectly smooth river stone, grey with a white band running through its center. We found this together. You said it was a lucky stone. Arthur stared at the stone, and the walls he had built around his past crumbled to dust. He was no longer Arthur Kent, the gunslinger. He was Art, a boy standing by a sun-dappled creek, holding hands with his best friend. The memory was so vivid it was a physical pain, a sharp ache in his chest for a life that was gone forever. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice raw. "How did you end up here?" Her smile faded. "My father died. There was no one left. A man came, a matchmaker. He said a wealthy American in Nevada wanted a wife. He showed me a picture of a fine house. He promised I would be cared for." She looked down at her tattered dress. The man was Mr. Sterling. The name again. Josiah Sterling. The man who owned the best land, the man who had bought and discarded a human being as if she were a broken tool. "He brought me here by wagon," I continued. "When I arrived, he looked at me with disgust. He said the matchmaker had lied about my age, my appearance. He said I was not what he paid for. He refused to file the marriage papers. He locked me in a room for a week, and then this morning, he threw me out. He kept my belongings, my money. Everything." A cold, familiar anger began to build in Arthur's veins. It was the same rage that had sent him down the path of the gun all those years ago. He had thought it was buried, but it was only sleeping. Before he could speak, there was a heavy knock on the door. Arthur's hand instinctively went to his pistol. He moved to the side of the door and opened it a crack. A portly, well-dressed man stood in the hallway, a gold watch chain gleaming on his silk vest. He had a neatly trimmed beard and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Behind him stood two large, thuggish-looking men. "Mr. Kent, I presume," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "My name is Josiah Sterling. I believe you have something that belongs to me." His eyes flicked past Arthur to Mai, who had shrunk back into the shadows of the room. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Arthur said, his body tense. Sterling chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "There is a contract, Mr. Kent. A bill of sale. I paid a handsome sum for her passage and her hand. She is my property until that debt is settled. Legally. The law seems to be whatever you say it is in this town," Arthur countered. "Precisely," Sterling said, his smile widening. "I came here as a courtesy. I am a reasonable man. The woman is of no use to me now. Damaged goods, you might say. But my investment must be recouped. $500. Pay her debt, and she is free to go. Otherwise, she comes with me. I'll find some way for her to work it off at one of my mining camps." The unspoken threat hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Arthur knew what life was like for a woman in a mining camp. Sterling was not just threatening debt servitude, he was threatening something far worse. $500. It was a quarter of everything Arthur had. It was the down payment on his land, on his future, on his chance to be someone else. He looked at Sterling's smug face, then back at Mai. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, but her fists were clenched at her sides. He saw in her the same stubborn girl who wouldn't back down from a dare at the creek's edge. He had a choice. He could pay the man and walk away, poorer but free. Or he could stand his ground, a decision that would lead, inevitably, to violence. But looking at Mai, at the ghost of the friend he had lost so long ago, he realized there was no choice at all. Some debts had to be paid. "You'll get your money," Arthur said, his voice like flint. He pulled a roll of bills from his pocket, counted out $500, and thrust it at Sterling. "Now get out." Sterling took the money, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Kent." He gave a mock bow and turned, his hired thugs following him down the hall. The door clicked shut, leaving Arthur and Mai in silence. The money was gone. his dream of a quiet homestead was gone with it. He was back where he started, with a gun on his hip and trouble at his heels. But as he looked at Mai, something loosened in his chest. He hadn't just bought her freedom. He had bought back a piece of his own. 6 months later, the first snows were dusting the peaks of the mountains surrounding Redemption Gulch. The homestead Arthur had managed to buy was not the high meadow plot he had once coveted, but a smaller, rockier piece of land down in the valley, one Sterling had overlooked. Its cabin was little more than a dugout with a clapboard front, but it was sturdy, and the well drew clean, cold water. Arthur was in the small corral he had built, mending a piece of tack for Bess. His hands, once steady only on the grip of a pistol, were now calloused and competent with an awl and leather. The work was hard, honest, and it was slowly healing him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Mai came out of the cabin, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. She no longer wore the tattered dress of a cast-off. She wore a simple work dress of sturdy blue cotton, and her bare feet were now shod in practical leather boots. She had filled out, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a quiet confidence. She had proven to be as tireless a worker as he was, her knowledge of gardening turning their stubborn patch of earth into a productive plot of vegetables they sold in town. She handed him the mug. "You'll freeze your fingers off out here," she said. "Almost done," he replied, taking a sip of the hot coffee. It warmed him all the way through. Their partnership was one of quiet understanding. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, speaking little, but always aware of each other's presence. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and she would tell him stories of her village, and he, slowly and hesitantly, would tell her about the long, lonely years he had spent drifting. The threat of Josiah Sterling had not disappeared overnight. For weeks after Arthur paid the debt, Sterling's men had watched him, looking for an excuse to start trouble. But Arthur gave them none. He was no longer a gunslinger looking for a fight. He was a homesteader, and his battles were with the land. The town, which had first seen him as a dangerous drifter, began to see him differently. They saw a man who worked hard, paid his bills, and stood by his word. The end for Sterling came not with a gunshot, but with a piece of paper. Mai had kept a small ledger, a habit her father had taught her, detailing the fraudulent weights and supply orders she had witnessed during her brief time in Sterling's house. She had seen him cheating the railroad company he was contracted to. On her urging, Arthur had sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal in Carson City. When the law finally arrived, Sterling's empire of bluff and intimidation collapsed. He was arrested for fraud, his assets seized, his power in Redemption Gulch broken for good. Arthur finished his mending and looked at Mai. She was staring out at the land they had tamed together, a faint smile on her face. In her hand, she was turning over the smooth, grey river stone. The lucky stone. It had survived a journey across an ocean, survived cruelty and despair, and found its way back to him. He had ridden into Redemption Gulch a man running from his past, seeking a solitary future. He had found, instead, that the only thing worth having was a piece of that past, a connection to the boy he had been. He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused fingers closing over hers and the stone. A man's life, he reckoned, wasn't defined by what he ran from, but by what he chose to hold on to. And in the quiet chill of the coming winter, holding Mai's hand, Arthur Kent finally felt like he was home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.